Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because I swear to you, what happened at my own baby shower was so surreal that even as I stood there, listening to my mother with a microphone in her hand, I couldn't believe that she actually said the words out loud in front of everyone. 1 second, people were clapping and laughing and passing around plates of cake, and the next second, my mother smiled like she was about to deliver some heartfelt speech, and instead she announced, clear as day, that all the gifts everyone had so generously brought for me and my baby would actually be going to my sister, because apparently she was the one who really needed them. The sound in the room shifted instantly, and I felt my stomach drop in a way I don't think I will ever forget. You know that kind of moment where you half wonder if maybe you misheard someone, because it just doesn't make sense that they could be that bold, that dismissive, and that shameless all at once? That's where I was standing frozen, trying to process how a celebration that was supposed to be about the new life my husband and I were bringing into the world had just been turned into yet another moment where my family's old patterns played out in full view of everyone I cared about. And it wasn't like this came out of nowhere. My sister, Megan, has always been the one with the constant crises, the sudden financial disasters, the endless calls to my mother about needing help with this bill or that rent check, and my mother, Linda, has always been the first to swoop in, rearrange priorities, and declare that family helps family. But the unspoken rule always meant that my needs, my milestones, and frankly my accomplishments were treated as optional, because I was the capable one, the child who could figure things out on her own, the one who didn't need as much. I thought maybe, just maybe, a baby shower would be different. Turns out, I was wrong. When my mom's words landed, people laughed nervously, like maybe it was a joke. But I could see it in her face, she wasn't joking at all. She was dead serious, and the more silence filled the room, the more she leaned into it, explaining that Megan had a toddler already and no resources to replace the things she lost when she moved apartments, and that I had a good husband, a solid job, and plenty of support. So why not redirect the gifts to where they were actually useful? I wish I could tell you I jumped up, shouted her down, and defended myself right away, but in that moment, I felt all those years of swallowing my frustration and keeping the peace come back like muscle memory. I froze. I looked at Evan, my husband, and I saw his face tighten, not angry in an explosive way, but angry in the kind of way where you know someone has been waiting for this exact moment to finally put an end to the nonsense. He reached over, touched my hand lightly, and said quietly, "Take a breath. I've got it." That was the first time I exhaled in what felt like a full minute, and, before I could even think, he stood up from his chair, walked to the front of the room, and faced my mom. The entire room hushed, because everyone could feel the shift. Evan wasn't loud, but his voice carried perfectly. He said, "Funny. Because these say otherwise." And then he held up a thick stack of papers, neatly clipped, like he had been waiting for this exact ambush. The look on my mother's face, I'll never forget it, because for once she wasn't in full control of the narrative. People leaned forward in their chairs, wondering what exactly was in those papers, and I could see my sister start to fidget, glancing at the doors like maybe she wanted to step outside before things got worse. My mother tried to laugh, saying, "Oh, Evan, don't make such a big deal. It's just gifts," but he didn't even flinch. He handed the top paper to the venue manager, who happened to be standing by the dessert table, and said calmly, "You'll want to hold on to that for just a moment." And that's when it hit me, Evan had planned for this. He hadn't just hoped my family would behave. He had prepared, quietly, meticulously, for exactly the stunt my mom had just pulled, and now, in front of everyone. He was about to make it crystal clear that this baby shower was not going to turn into yet another free-for-all where Megan walked away with things that weren't hers. The air in the room shifted again, heavier this time, as the guests realized something serious was unfolding. Some of them leaned closer to each other, whispering, and others sat back with their arms crossed, waiting to see what would happen next. I stayed rooted in my chair, my pulse pounding in my ears, torn between relief that Evan was handling it and panic about how far he was about to go, because I knew whatever those papers were, they weren't just casual notes, he had something solid. And once he said it out loud, there was no way to take it back. And right there, in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about the gifts anymore. It was about years of letting myself be talked over, letting Megan's emergencies define the tone of every family gathering, and letting my mother rewrite the rules so that I was always the one giving instead of receiving. Evan wasn't just defending the baby gifts. He was defending me, and in doing so, he was about to change the rules of this family dynamic forever. So when he looked back at me and gave the slightest nod, like he was asking for my silent permission to go all the way, I didn't speak, but I nodded back, and he turned to the room again. He tapped the papers lightly, smiled once, and said, "Let's clear this up now before anyone accidentally walks out of here with the wrong bag." And that's where I'll leave you for now, because you'll never believe what he revealed on the very next page. Can you guess what happened next? When I look back at the weeks leading up to that baby shower, I realized that my husband had been quietly preparing for a moment that I honestly hoped would never come. And while I told myself that maybe my mother would keep her impulses in check, and maybe my sister would finally understand that this was not her turn to take center stage, Evan was already gathering proof, arranging policies, and setting up the kind of structure that no one could wiggle out of once the pressure was on, because in his words, receipts don't care about feelings. He knew that arguing with my mom or my sister was useless since they could spin things, cry, or guilt people into siding with them, but documents had no patience for drama, and once those were on the table, everything became a matter of facts instead of opinions. The reason he had gone to those lengths was simple. Megan had a history, and not just a minor one, of borrowing items from family events under the guise of helping or temporarily holding onto something, only for those same items to mysteriously pop up on Facebook Marketplace a week later with blurry photos and vague descriptions. And when someone would point it out, my mom would always defend her by saying she needed money more than things, and that we should all be understanding because life had dealt her a tough hand. I still remember one Thanksgiving when a cousin brought over a brand new stroller for another relative's shower, and by Christmas, that exact stroller, with the same scratch on the handle, was listed online with Megan's account name attached. Everyone whispered, no one confronted her, and my mom insisted it was a misunderstanding, but deep down, everyone knew the truth. So when we started planning the baby shower, Evan refused to let us ignore the elephant in the room. He told me plainly that while he couldn't control what my family tried to pull, he could make sure that the two of us controlled how we responded, and that meant building a paper trail before the first guest even arrived. He switched our registry so that all returns and exchanges were locked to our account only, which meant no one could walk into a store and claim a refund or swap items without our ID. He went further by ordering tiny coded stickers that he placed discreetly under the tape of every box that came directly from the registry, so if something disappeared and turned up online, it could be traced. At first, I laughed and said he was going overboard, but he looked me in the eye and said, "You've been conditioned to think planning is paranoia, but I promise you, it's just preparation." We even worked with a consumer rights attorney friend of his who drafted a single-page explainer that laid out, in plain language, what conditional gifts mean in our state, which basically says that when a gift is given for a specific occasion, like a baby shower, it is tied to that event and the intended recipient, and diverting it without donor consent could be considered theft or fraud. It wasn't a lawsuit, it wasn't a threat, it was just clarity, and Evan wanted to have it printed and ready in case anyone tried to twist the narrative. At the time, I thought it was excessive, but after seeing my mom's little stunt with the microphone, I understood exactly why he had been so insistent. When Evan handed that first paper to the venue manager, the room went quiet, and he calmly explained that the document on top was the hosting contract, which named me and him as the only authorized hosts for the event, and that meant any announcement about gifts, transfers, or redirection without our consent had no standing. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't emotional, he was simply stating facts, and the venue manager, who had been watching nervously, nodded and tucked the paper into her binder as if to say, "This is now official." My mother's smile faltered, and I could see her trying to calculate how to spin this into something harmless, but Evan wasn't giving her room to maneuver. He then pulled out the second sheet, which was that plain language explainer from the attorney, and he read a line that made my stomach flip. Any diversion of gifts away from the intended recipient without explicit donor approval constitutes a breach of donor intent and may be subject to recovery by the rightful recipient. The way he said it wasn't theatrical, it was steady, like a teacher reading from a lesson plan, but the impact was immediate because suddenly the room shifted from polite discomfort to genuine unease, and people began glancing at their own gifts piled near the table as if to reassure themselves that they were still in the right place. I watched my mom open her mouth to argue, but before she could, Aunt Carol leaned over and whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear, "I just saw Megan loading something into her car." My heart stopped for a second, and then I saw Evan give the faintest smile, because he was already ahead of that move too. He turned back to the guests and said calmly, "That's why we prepared a second set of records, to make sure nothing goes missing without accountability." The guests started murmuring, some shocked, some clearly entertained, because they had seen versions of this family circus before, but never with someone actually standing firm and prepared. In that instant, I realized that Evan wasn't just handling a single baby shower dispute, he was unraveling years of manipulation in real time, showing everyone that our lives weren't going to be dictated by favoritism, excuses, or guilt anymore. He was using the one thing my mom and Megan couldn't control, proof, and the more he laid it out, the more the room leaned toward us, not them. And while part of me was terrified about what Megan had taken to her car and what drama would come next, another part of me, one that had been buried for years, felt a strange, almost guilty relief. For once, I wasn't the one standing up, shaking, defending myself. I was watching someone else do it, someone who wasn't afraid of the fallout, because he knew exactly what he was holding in his hands. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just going to be a scene that faded away after everyone went home. This was the beginning of a line being drawn so clearly that no one could pretend not to see it, and Evan was about to reveal just how far that line extended. And believe me, you'll want to hear what came next, because when he brought out that second set, the entire mood in the room shifted from uncomfortable laughter to the kind of silence where you know something big is about to drop. The second Evan mentioned that we had a second set of records, the atmosphere in the room shifted from awkward tension into something sharper, almost electric. Because suddenly people were no longer looking at me with pity or at my mother with polite smiles, they were looking at Megan, who had conveniently slipped out of her chair during the commotion and was nowhere to be seen. And that silence was broken only when Aunt Carol repeated, a little louder this time, that she had definitely seen Megan carrying a gift bag to her car earlier, and she didn't think it was hers to take. That comment landed like a rock dropped into still water, and the ripples were immediate because everyone in that room knew Megan's history, even if no one ever dared to say it out loud before, and Evan, calm as ever, leaned down, picked up the laptop he had set up for what was supposed to be a slideshow of baby photos, and connected it to the projector with the same composure as if he were at work giving a presentation. At first, people thought maybe he was going to show a timeline of the pregnancy or some cute memory, but when the screen flickered on, what appeared instead were screenshots, each one time-stamped and saved carefully, showing online listings from the past year with Megan's name, her account photo, and the exact same items that had been given at other family events, right down to the wrapping paper. The first was a stroller from my cousin's shower, the one that everyone had whispered about last Christmas, and there it was, photographed against the wall of my mother's dining room, listed for cash pickup only. The second was a crib set, still sealed in the box with a gift tag that clearly wasn't meant for her, and again it had been listed within days of the event. And then there were smaller things, bottles, toys, even a diaper bag that she had claimed were duplicates or extras and had quietly resold. The room went dead silent as Evan clicked through the slides one by one, not embellishing, not accusing, just showing what was already public, and with each click, you could hear the shift in the crowd as donors who had once been brushed off by my mom's excuses now realized that their suspicions had been correct all along. My mother tried to interject, saying things like, "This isn't the time," or "You're embarrassing the family," but her voice sounded thinner than usual, and for the first time in my life, I watched her struggle to regain control of a room that was no longer willing to nod along to her explanations. Evan finally paused the slideshow and looked out at the guests, his tone measured but firm, and he said that we understood how much thought and care went into every gift and that we respected each donor's intent, which was why we wanted to give people an option, right then and there, to decide what should happen next. He explained that if anyone felt uncomfortable leaving their gift in the pile after what they had just seen, they could request a store refund through the registry, which he had locked to our account for exactly this reason. And then they could repurchase at their convenience to ensure the items stayed with us. On the other hand, if they were fine leaving things as they were, we would personally send them a confirmation once each gift was logged and tied to the baby's trust, with receipts emailed back for transparency. He wasn't forcing anyone into one path or another, he was giving them control, which ironically was the exact opposite of what my mother had tried to do. Minutes earlier with her announcement, the reaction was astonishing. A few guests immediately raised their hands to say they wanted refunds, not because they didn't trust us, but because they wanted the reassurance that their gifts would not be stolen, and a few others nodded vigorously, clearly relieved that someone had finally drawn a hard line against Megan's behavior. Others clapped softly, the kind of applause you give when you've been waiting years for someone to tell the truth out loud. My mother's face darkened, and she snapped that I was punishing family by letting this play out, that I was humiliating my sister for no reason, and that all of this could have been handled privately. But I had reached a point where I couldn't swallow the words anymore, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't back down. I looked directly at her and said, clearly enough for the entire room to hear, "No, Mom, I am not punishing family. I am protecting my child." My voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally speaking the truth in front of everyone, and that statement hung in the air longer than I expected, almost like it echoed. Evan placed his hand on my shoulder, a steady anchor, and then I remembered the envelope I had tucked into my purse the night before, the one he had insisted I carry myself even though I thought it was unnecessary. I reached down, pulled it out, and held it in my hand as I turned back toward the guests. I said, and since we're telling the truth here, there is something else you should all know, because if anyone tries to walk out of this room with even a single item that isn't theirs, we already have instructions prepared for exactly how that will be handled. My mother's eyes widened, and I saw a flicker of real fear for the first time, because she knew Evan wasn't bluffing, and she also knew that I wasn't hiding behind him anymore. The guests leaned in, curious, and some of them almost gasped as I started to open the envelope, because they could sense that this wasn't just a symbolic gesture, that there was something real inside it that would carry consequences. And for the first time in my life, I felt the room shift in my direction, like people were waiting to hear what I had to say instead of dismissing it or twisting it to fit someone else's story. And that was the moment I realized that once I spoke the contents of that envelope aloud, there would be no going back to the old family dynamic, no pretending it was just misunderstandings or bad timing. Because this was about to become a boundary with teeth, and boundaries with teeth tend to leave marks. So as I held it tightly in my hand, my heart pounding harder than it had in months, I looked around the room, made eye contact with a few guests who had supported me quietly over the years, and said, "Do you want to know exactly what happens next?" Because I was finally ready to show them that this wasn't just about gifts, it was about drawing a line in permanent ink, and everyone in that room was about to see it for themselves. The air in the room seemed to thicken the moment I stepped through the doorway, not because of the heat from the sun outside or the lingering scent of stale perfume from the previous evening's dinner, but because the atmosphere had shifted into one of palpable expectation, a tension that crawled across the skin like static electricity, as if every person present had been waiting for this precise moment to finally see the threads of deceit unravel in front of them, and I could feel their eyes on me, scanning my posture, my expression, the way I carried myself as I tried to balance the nervousness knotting my stomach with the controlled calm I knew I would need if I wanted to see this confrontation through without losing composure. My mother, sitting at the head of the dining table with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glanced up from the paperwork she had been pretending to review, and in that split second, I recognized the flash of irritation and fear that always appeared whenever she realized she had lost even a fraction of the control she thought was hers, while across from her, Megan slouched in her chair, a faint smirk tugging at her lips that seemed to suggest she believed she had already won before the conversation even began. And I hated that she was right in that calculation, knowing that every word I spoke would be scrutinized and twisted before it had a chance to land, but I had rehearsed this moment enough times in my head to know that hesitation was a luxury I could no longer afford. I placed my bag on the side table and pulled out the folder that contained everything I had painstakingly compiled over the past several months, the evidence of the patterns no one else had wanted to acknowledge, photographs, receipts, copies of messages, and a meticulous timeline of events that would leave no room for excuses. And as I set it on the polished surface of the dining table, the slight clatter of paper against would seem to punctuate the shift in the room, signaling that this was no longer a casual family discussion but a deliberate and methodical presentation of the truth, and I could see the change ripple through the guests who had gathered there, some stiffening in their chairs, others leaning forward as if they could feel the weight of the information pressing down on their conscience, all of them aware that the careful facades we had maintained for years were about to crumble under the pressure of facts laid bare. Taking a deep breath, I began to speak, my voice steady but filled with the kind of quiet intensity that only comes from long-suppressed frustration finally finding its outlet, explaining the discrepancies I had discovered. The inconsistencies in Megan's stories, the items she had claimed as gifts for herself that had not been hers to take, and the financial manipulations that had allowed her to profit quietly while others remained oblivious or unwilling to question her actions. And with each sentence, I observed the subtle shifts in expression on my mother's face, the way her eyes darted to avoid direct contact, the way her hands flexed and unflexed in her lap, the slight tension in her jaw that suggested she knew I was speaking truths she could neither refute nor deflect, while Megan's smirk faltered and then reformed into something more defensive. A thin barrier she had erected against the undeniable evidence I presented, and yet I could see the cracks forming, the small hesitations and flickers of uncertainty that revealed that even she could not fully reconcile her actions with the reality I had meticulously documented. I continued, detailing not just the individual incidents, but the pattern they formed, illustrating a behavior that could no longer be ignored, contextualizing it in a way that made it impossible for anyone present to dismiss as coincidence or miscommunication, highlighting the emotional toll it had taken on me, on my family, and on those who had trusted Megan. And as I spoke, I noticed the guests exchanging glances, a silent dialogue of realization and quiet validation, a collective acknowledgement that the narrative they had been quietly doubting had, in fact, been correct all along, and the power dynamic that had long favored my mother and sister began to shift. The authority they had wielded now challenged by facts that could not be rewritten or smoothed over with charm or manipulation. When I finally reached the end of my presentation, I paused, letting the silence stretch long enough that it became almost tangible, a moment suspended in time where judgment and anticipation hung in the air, and then, with deliberate clarity, I addressed both my mother and Megan directly, stating that the cycle of deception could no longer continue unchecked, that boundaries were necessary not only for my own peace of mind, but for the integrity of every relationship present in that room, and that moving forward, accountability would not be negotiable, that transparency and honesty were not merely expectations, but requirements, and that any attempt to circumvent these principles would be met with consequences that had been carefully prepared and were now publicly acknowledged, because the choice to confront the truth had finally been made. And there was no returning to the pretense of ignorance that had allowed harm to go unnoticed for so long. As the weight of my words settled over the room, I could see the change solidify in real time, the recalibration of alliances, the subtle nods of support from those who had silently suffered under the shadow of deceit, the uneasy shuffling of those who had benefited indirectly from the concealment, and the realization on my mother's and Megan's faces that the rules had irrevocably changed, that the narrative could no longer be controlled by charm or denial, and that the consequences of past Actions were finally ready to manifest in full, and in that moment, I understood that the confrontation had succeeded not because it had humiliated anyone, but because it had illuminated the truth so clearly that the only viable path forward was one shaped by accountability, clarity, and the unyielding assertion of boundaries that could no longer be ignored. The house was unnervingly quiet the morning after the confrontation, not in the peaceful way that suggests contentment or resolution, but in the heavy, almost oppressive stillness that hangs in the air when unspoken truths have been laid bare and everyone present is forced to reckon with the reality that nothing could ever return to the familiar rhythm of pretense. And as I walked through the hallways, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against my shoulders, I noticed the subtle signs of change etched into the environment itself. The empty chair at the head of the dining table, where my mother had spent so many hours asserting authority with a tone of imperious control, now stood as a stark reminder that influence can no longer be wielded solely through presence, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet echoing the delicate balance of tension and uncertainty that had settled over the household, and the faint smell of lingering coffee, untouched since the previous evening, seemed to symbolize the pause in habitual routines, a space deliberately left for reflection, accountability, and the fragile rebuilding of trust that had been fractured beyond simple repair. As the hours passed, I could sense the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of those around me as they navigated this new reality. Their actions carefully measured to avoid confrontation, yet inevitably shaped by the knowledge that the protective illusions of the past had been irrevocably dismantled. And when I finally encountered Megan in the living room, sprawled across the sofa with a posture that suggested both defiance and resignation, I realized that the complexity of her response could not be distilled into a single emotion. It was a volatile mixture of anger at being exposed, fear of consequences that she had long believed herself immune to, and the rare glimmer of understanding that perhaps the narratives she had manipulated were no longer under her control. And in that moment, I recognized that victory was not in forcing acknowledgement, but in creating a space where accountability could no longer be evaded, where every action would now be measured against the unalterable truth, and where the dynamics of influence, once skewed heavily in her favor, were finally balanced by the clarity of evidence and the persistence of resolve. The conversations that followed were cautious, deliberate, and painstakingly slow, each word weighed for its potential to either heal or inflame, and I found myself navigating a landscape that required not only patience, but also the careful calibration of empathy and firmness. For while the revelations had shifted the power balance, they had also opened wounds that would not simply close with the passage of time, and every interaction became a negotiation between the acknowledgement of past harms and the possibility of redefining the future in a way that honored the boundaries I had finally imposed. Boundaries that were no longer theoretical, but actively reinforced by the tangible consequences that had been clearly communicated the night before. And as I observed the subtle adjustments in my mother's tone and Megan's guarded expressions, I understood that the process of recalibration was underway, that the unspoken understanding of limits, respect, and accountability was slowly embedding itself into the behavior of those who had once assumed that manipulation and charm could indefinitely dictate outcomes without scrutiny or resistance. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the house had shifted from an almost suffocating weight to a more measured, controlled energy, the kind that arises when a storm has passed and those affected are left to assess the damage, repair what can be repaired, and make deliberate decisions about the path forward. And in this quiet aftermath, I found myself reflecting not on triumph or vindication, but on the subtleties of human behavior, the fragility of constructed hierarchies, and the resilience required to maintain integrity in the face of sustained manipulation, recognizing that the confrontation, though difficult, had been a necessary catalyst not only for my own liberation from the pressures of deceit and favoritism, but also for the potential growth of those around me who were now confronted with a version of reality they could neither ignore nor distort. And that the slow, intentional rebuilding of trust, respect, and honest communication would be the measure of true success, rather than any fleeting satisfaction derived from exposure alone. As evening fell and the first pale light of dusk filtered through the windows, casting long, muted shadows across the rooms, I felt a sense of cautious optimism mingled with the exhaustion of emotional labor well spent. For the environment had irrevocably changed in a way that allowed for authenticity to replace pretense, and though the road ahead remained uncertain and required constant vigilance to prevent old patterns from reasserting themselves, the clarity of boundaries, the undeniable evidence of past actions, and the deliberate commitment to accountability established a foundation that could no longer be easily undermined, while the small, subtle gestures of acknowledgement from those who had witnessed the confrontation, an almost imperceptible nod, a brief moment of eye contact without defensiveness, hinted at the possibility of reconciliation and mutual respect that, though fragile, now had a legitimate opportunity to take root in a household that had, for so long, been defined by imbalance, favoritism, and unchallenged deception. And as I finally sat alone in the quiet of my room, letting the weight of the day settle into reflection rather than resentment, I understood that this was not an ending, but the beginning of a new chapter defined by the courage to confront truth, the patience to enforce boundaries, and the unwavering determination to ensure that honesty, once spoken, would remain an enduring principle guiding every interaction that followed.